I had always been the kind of person who loved road trips. There was something about the freedom of the open road, the endless horizon, and the feeling of being completely alone. I was driving across the rural stretch of highway that cuts through the heart of America, far away from the bustling cities, just me and my car. I was on my way to a small town to visit an old friend, and I had no idea that this trip would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. It was around midnight when it happened. The car had been running fine up until that point. I wasn't paying much attention to the gas gauge. I was too busy singing along to my favorite tunes. The road ahead seemed endless, and the moonlight cast an eerie glow over the flat plains. The occasional farmhouse was just a distant shadow, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. I was about 50 miles from the nearest gas station when it started. The engine sputtered, and then the car jerked. I glanced at the fuel gauge in a panic, empty. The needle was on E, and I cursed under my breath. I had been so distracted by the drive that I hadn't even noticed how low I was. The car coasted for a few seconds before it completely stalled, coming to a stop in the middle of the highway. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine didn't even try to start. My stomach dropped. There was no one around. No cars, no lights, just the dark, quiet stretch of highway. I had no choice but to get out of the car and assess the situation. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but of course there was no signal. I tried again and again, but the screen remained blank, showing no service. The thought of walking to the nearest town crossed my mind, but I quickly dismissed it. It was a good 50 miles away, and walking in the dark with no flashlight was not something I wanted to risk. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a small dot of light in the distance, barely noticeable. It flickered like a lantern or a distant car's headlights. I squinted and watched as the light grew brighter and started moving toward me. My heart raced, and I thought that maybe someone was coming to help. But the light didn't come closer in a straight line. It swayed back and forth, like a person stumbling down the road. I stood frozen, watching it get nearer. The closer it got, the more I realized something wasn't right. The light wasn't from a car, and it wasn't from a lantern. It was too faint, too erratic. It almost looked like it was floating. My breath caught in my throat as the light drew nearer, revealing a figure, or rather a shadow, in the distance. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. His shape was blurry, like a distorted figure, almost ghost-like. He seemed to sway as he walked, dragging his feet along the road. His face was hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could see the outline of his tattered clothes. He wore a long, dusty coat that seemed out of place, as though he had been walking down that highway for years. My heart pounded as I took a step back, unsure whether to stay put or run. The figure grew closer, and the light grew dimmer. It was as though the closer he came, the more the light seemed to fade. The wind picked up, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling. "Can you help me? I'm out of gas! I need a ride!" The man didn't respond. He just kept walking, swaying slowly from side to side. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, as though he wasn't in any hurry to reach me. And then suddenly he stopped. I froze, not sure what to do. The silence was deafening. The air felt thick, heavy, as though something unseen was watching me. I glanced nervously around, but there was no one else. Just the empty highway stretching out in both directions. And then he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but I could hear every word clearly. "You're out of gas." I was taken aback. How did he know? I hadn't said anything about it to him. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. "Yes," I said, my voice cracking. "I need a ride to the next town. My phone doesn't work, and I don't know what to do." The man didn't respond. Instead, he began to move toward me again, slowly, one step at a time. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from him. The closer he got, the more the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. As he reached the edge of my car, I could see his face for the first time. It was pale, almost sickly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. His skin was cracked like old leather, and his mouth was twisted into a faint, almost mocking smile. His face was gaunt, and his hair, what little of it was left, hung in greasy strands over his forehead. "You shouldn't have come out here," he said, his voice raspy, like he hadn't spoken in years. "Please," I begged, stepping back. I just need help." The man didn't move. Instead, his eyes seemed to widen, and for a moment, I could see the faintest flicker of something dark behind them. A chill ran down my spine. "Don't worry," he said, his grin widening. "You won't have to go anywhere. Not for a long time." I took a deep breath, panic rising in my chest. I had to get out of here. I had to get away. But before I could turn to run, the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped suddenly, and I felt the cold creeping in around me, even though I had no idea where it came from. "Don't run," he said, his voice now cold and sharp. "You can't escape." I whipped around, glancing at my car. My heart sank as I saw the headlights flicker on, the engine roaring to life. It shouldn't have been possible. It had been dead just moments ago. But the car was running, and as I turned back to the man, I saw his figure beginning to fade into the night. Before I could process what was happening, the car door swung open as though someone or something had opened it for me. The man's voice echoed in the distance, his laughter chilling and hollow. "You'll be back. You'll never leave." The headlights blinded me as I stumbled into the car, my hands shaking as I slammed the door shut. I floored the gas pedal, racing down the highway, not daring to look back. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, nearly 60 miles away, my mind racing with disbelief and fear. I never saw the man again, but the memory of his face, his words, haunts me to this day. I never drive at night on that highway anymore, and if I'm ever low on gas, I'll make sure to stop long before the needle hits empty. But sometimes when I'm driving alone, I swear I can still hear his voice in the wind, echoing across the empty highway. "You'll be back. You'll never leave."
Next story.
I'll never forget the night I ran out of gas. It was like something straight out of one of those horror stories you hear around campfires, only it was real. And I'm still not sure I've truly gotten over it. I was driving home from a business trip somewhere out in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest. You know, one of those long, never-ending highways that stretch on for miles, no sign of life anywhere, just fields and woods. The kind of place where if your car breaks down, you're pretty much on your own. It was late, around midnight, and I was the only one on the road. The headlights cast long shadows, the occasional tree or dilapidated sign flickering in the corner of my vision. I had been driving for hours and was feeling pretty exhausted. My gas gauge was in the red zone, but I figured I'd make it to the next town. I wasn't worried. I had done it 100 times before. I'd fill up when I got there, but then it happened. My car sputtered once, twice, and then died. I sighed, looking at the gas gauge that was now completely empty. "Great," I muttered to myself. I knew I should have filled up sooner, but it was too late for regret. The road ahead was deserted, and there was no sign of life for miles. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. Nothing but static. I knew I had to do something. There was no way around it. I couldn't just wait there for someone to come along. It could be hours. So, I grabbed my flashlight, locked the car, and started walking down the road in search of help. The air was cold and the moon hung high above, casting an eerie glow over everything. The stillness was unsettling. It felt as though the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw something. A small, dim light in the distance. A house. I wasn't sure if it was a mirage or real, but I figured it was worth checking out. Anything to get me out of this damn situation. I quickened my pace and soon found myself standing at the base of a long gravel driveway that led up to the house. It was an old farmhouse, the kind you see in horror movies. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. The paint was peeling off the walls, the windows were broken, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. But there was still that light, faint and flickering from a single window upstairs. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I knocked again, louder this time, but still no response. I was about to leave when the door creaked open just a little and I froze. A voice, faint and raspy, whispered from inside. "Are you lost, child?" I shivered, unsure if I had heard it correctly. But then, before I could react, the door slowly opened wider, revealing an old woman standing in the doorway. She was thin, wearing a long, tattered dress, and her hair was white, wild, and unkempt. Her eyes were piercing, black holes staring right through me. She didn't smile or say anything else, just stood there watching me like she was waiting for me to speak. I swallowed hard and said, "I'm sorry to bother you, but my car broke down a few miles back. I was hoping maybe I could use your phone or get some help." The woman didn't answer right away. She just stared at me with those unnerving eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and cold. "You shouldn't be out here this late." "I know, I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I just need a little help, please." The old woman didn't move. She didn't offer help, but she didn't turn me away either. She just nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. I was about to ask if I could come inside when I heard something. A noise. Faint at first, but growing louder. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, slow, and dragging. They were coming from somewhere inside the house. The woman didn't react, but my heart began to race. Something wasn't right. "Who's in there?" I asked, my voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. She simply stepped aside, and I took a hesitant step inside. The air was musty, like the house hadn't been lived in for decades. The walls were lined with old portraits, their faces blurry and faded. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I walked deeper into the house, following the sound of the dragging footsteps. I reached the stairs at the end of the hallway. The noise was louder now, as though someone or something was coming down the stairs. My skin crawled, but I couldn't turn back now. I had no choice but to move forward. I slowly ascended the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hand. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched in both directions, dark and ominous. But the footsteps were coming from the room at the end of the hall, the same room where the light flickered from behind the closed door. I walked toward the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel my breath quickening, my body trembling, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was in there. When I reached the door, I didn't knock. I just pushed it open slowly. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. A man, or what used to be a man, was sitting in an old rocking chair. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was motionless, but his mouth was open, his lips cracked as though he was trying to speak. There was a low, guttural moan coming from his throat, like he was trying to scream but couldn't. Behind him, the room was a nightmare. The walls were lined with old, cracked mirrors, each one reflecting a twisted, distorted version of the man. Some mirrors showed him younger, others older, some in horrific forms, his face contorted in pain or rage. And in the middle of the room, in the far corner, was a pile of broken bones, human bones, and what looked like claws. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The man's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought he was going to get up, come after me. But then I heard the woman's voice again, cold and indifferent. "He doesn't move unless you leave." My legs felt weak, my heart was hammering in my chest, but somehow I managed to turn around and stumble back down the hallway, my eyes never leaving the man. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. I reached the front door, nearly falling over myself to get outside. The air felt fresh, almost like I was being released from a nightmare. But as I looked back at the house, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A figure standing in the window. It was the woman, but she wasn't alone. The man, he was behind her now, standing with his twisted body, his eyes locked on mine. I didn't wait to see anything else. I ran back down the driveway, barely able to breathe as I sprinted toward the road. My car was still there, dead and silent, just like it had been when I left it. I didn't know how, but somehow I managed to get it started. And I drove, no looking back, no stopping. I just drove until I found a gas station hours later, my hands still shaking, my heart still racing. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? I've never driven down that road again. I've never gone anywhere near that house, and I don't think I ever will.
Next story.
It was late, far later than I expected to be driving. I had been out on a weekend road trip to visit a friend who had moved to the middle of nowhere in the Texas Hill Country. The plan was simple: drive down on Saturday, hang out, and head back Sunday afternoon. It should have been a smooth ride, but somehow it wasn't. By the time I turned onto the long, empty stretch of highway back toward home, the sun had already dipped behind the hills. I figured I had plenty of gas to make it, but I wasn't too familiar with the area. The little roadside gas station I passed about 20 miles ago didn't seem trustworthy, so I decided to keep going, thinking there'd be another one soon. But I didn't see one. And then the low gas light came on. I cursed under my breath. The roads out here were winding and isolated, so there wasn't exactly a chance to pull off and walk to find a station. I checked my phone, no signal. Great. The wind kicked up, sending a shiver down my spine. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The trees lining the road stood still, their shadows creeping across the road like silent witnesses. I started to slow down, realizing I might be in trouble, but I kept driving, hoping for the best. Maybe I'll get lucky, I muttered to myself, but deep down I knew I wasn't. My fuel gauge was nearly on empty, and my car sputtered as if it too was giving up. I gripped the wheel, trying to keep it steady, but there was no denying that I was running out of time. As I kept pushing forward, I saw something ahead, a light. I could barely make out a silhouette against the growing darkness. A building, maybe? I leaned forward, squinting at the figure. It looked like an old rundown gas station, just the kind of place I needed. A glimmer of hope surged through me, and I floored the accelerator, praying I could make it there before the engine gave out. The closer I got, the more I felt this eerie sense of unease. The place didn't look right. The gas pumps were old, cracked, and covered in dust. The building itself was barely standing, its windows shattered, the neon sign that once flashed open now flickering and dying. The place looked abandoned, as if it had been deserted for decades. But at this point, I didn't care. I pulled in, the tires crunching on the gravel, and parked in front of the pumps. I killed the engine. Silence. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dilapidated structure in front of me. My heart was pounding. I couldn't tell if I was more relieved or frightened. The station had no lights on and no sign of life. But the pumps, they were old, but they looked like they might still work. I got out of my car and approached them. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, like the air was thick with something I couldn't explain. I glanced around nervously. There were no other cars, no signs of any movement, just stillness. The wind howled through the trees. I reached for the nozzle and started pumping gas when I heard something. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, expecting to see someone walking up behind me, but no one was there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I looked around again. Still no one. My eyes kept darting between the empty road and the desolate building. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, I was just tired, stranded in the middle of nowhere. But the footsteps, they came again. Closer this time. I froze, gripping the nozzle, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't bring myself to. A strange coldness swept over me, and I could feel the tension in the air thickening. My breath came faster, shallow, as if my body knew something was wrong before my mind did. The hairs on my arms pricked up, my fingers tightening around the metal nozzle. That's when I heard a voice. Help. It was soft at first, a whisper in the wind, and then louder, clearer. A voice, trembling, as though it had been trapped in the air for ages. It sounded like a woman, but it was difficult to tell. The words were broken, desperate. Help me, the voice repeated, but it wasn't coming from the building or the trees. It was coming from the ground. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I dropped the nozzle, then like not caring about the gas spilling onto the pavement. Panic took over. I spun around to see if anyone else had pulled in, if anyone could explain this madness. But there was no one. No cars, no people. Just the oppressive silence that seemed to swallow everything. The air around me seemed to pulse with a strange energy. I could feel it vibrating under my feet, like the earth itself was alive. My eyes darted to the building again, and I swear I saw something move in the corner of one of the shattered windows. Something dark and shifting. Before I could process what I had seen, the voice came again, this time much closer. Help. Me. I whirled around, nearly tripping over my own feet. The voice was coming from beneath the ground, right at my feet. The gravel at the base of the pump started to shift as if something was pushing up from beneath it. I backed away, my breath quick and shallow. I was about to bolt to my car when I heard the sound of something scraping against metal. Something clawing from underneath, the sound sending ice through my veins. It was followed by a loud thud. And then a figure, a woman, gaunt and pale, her clothes torn, emerged from beneath the ground. I screamed, falling back in horror. She was staring right at me, her hollow eyes filled with desperation, her lips barely moving as she continued to whisper, "Help me." I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen. The woman's fingers, skeletal, twisted, reached up as if begging for something I couldn't understand. Her face twisted in agony, as if she had been trapped for a lifetime, and her mouth opened wider, revealing sharp, broken teeth. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own legs and landing hard on the gravel. My heart pounded in my chest, my body shaking uncontrollably. I scrambled for my keys, but my fingers fumbled with them, the sound of her raspy breath echoing in the dead silence. She was getting closer, dragging herself from the earth with unnatural speed, her arms flailing wildly. Help me. With a final panicked cry, I pushed myself to my feet and sprinted to my car, fumbling to unlock the door. My hands shook as I yanked it open and slammed it shut behind me. My foot slammed on the gas pedal and I peeled out of there, leaving the haunted gas station behind me in a cloud of dust. I didn't stop driving until I hit the next town. I don't remember how long it took to get there, but I know that I couldn't shake the image of that woman, her empty, pleading eyes. I parked at the first diner I could find, trying to calm my racing heart. The waitress looked at me strangely when I walked in, but I was too shaken to explain. I just ordered coffee and sat there, staring at my trembling hands. After a while, I worked up the courage to ask the waitress about the gas station. She frowned. That old place? It's been abandoned for years. People say it's cursed. No one dares go near it anymore. I didn't say anything, just nodded, but I didn't need to ask anything else. I knew it was real. I knew what I had seen. That place was no ordinary gas station, and whatever it was, whatever had been buried beneath it, was still waiting for its next victim.
Next story.
I remember that night like it was yesterday. I can't forget it, no matter how hard I try. It's the kind of thing that stays with you, gnaws at your bones even years later. It's a horror that doesn't just fade with time, it grows. The night I ran out of gas, it had been a long day and I was heading home after a trip to see family. It was late, around 2 a.m., and I was on an old highway through some rural backcountry. The kind of place where the only signs of life are the occasional deer darting across the road or the endless stretch of trees that seem to absorb any light you have. No streetlights, no gas stations, nothing. Just me and my car and the quiet hum of the engine. I knew I was pushing it with the gas. The needle was in the red, and I should have filled up hours ago, but I thought I could make it just a little farther. I kept telling myself the next exit would have a gas station or a town, but it never came. The empty road stretched on, and I had no choice but to keep going. Eventually, the engine started to sputter. The car slowed, and the dashboard lit up with warnings. Low fuel. My stomach dropped. I had miscalculated. I glanced around, but there was nothing in sight. No house, no gas station, just miles of dark road ahead of me. Then, with one final shudder, the car died completely. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dark highway. The silence was so thick, it felt suffocating. I grabbed my phone, hoping to at least get some signal. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a single bar. I looked at the empty road in front of me and knew I had no choice but to try and walk to find help. I grabbed my flashlight, locked the car, and stepped out into the cool night air. The silence was unsettling. Even the usual sounds of crickets or distant animals seemed absent. The only noise was the occasional gust of wind rustling through the trees. It made my skin crawl. I walked for what felt like miles, my footsteps echoing on the gravel. My flashlight's beam was weak, casting long, shaky shadows. I was starting to lose hope when, in the distance, I saw a faint light. A house. Or at least, I thought it was a house. It was just a small glow, barely visible through the trees, but it was enough to give me a sense of direction. I picked up my pace, eager to find shelter, or at least some kind of help. When I reached the house, I didn't know what to expect. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the windows boarded up, the porch sagging with neglect. But there was that light, flickering faintly from behind the curtains. A single light, low and warm. I knocked, hoping someone would answer. The door creaked open and an elderly man stood there. He was tall, gaunt, with a pale, almost translucent complexion. His clothes were worn, faded, like they hadn't been replaced in years. His eyes, though, those were the strangest part. They were wide and unblinking, like he'd been staring at something in the distance for far too long. "Can I help you?" he asked in a gravely voice. I hesitated, but then explained my situation. "My car broke down about a mile back. I was hoping I could use your phone to call for a tow or something." He didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, his gaze unsettlingly intense. After a long silence, he stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. I don't know why I walked in. Something about him felt off, but I was tired and desperate. I needed help. The house smelled musty, old, and there was a chill in the air that seemed to seep through the walls. The interior was dimly lit, but the light was coming from a strange source, a lantern on the table, its flame flickering but steady. The shadows in the room seemed deeper than they should be. "Take a seat," he said, his voice still eerily calm. "You can wait for a while. We'll get you sorted." I nodded, sitting down at the table, my mind still racing. I tried to keep my composure, but something wasn't right. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the room and noticed something strange. In the corner, partially obscured by the shadows, was a large wooden chest, its lid slightly ajar. The man sat across from me, watching me with those unsettling eyes. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he stood up and walked over to the chest. My heart skipped a beat as he pulled it open, revealing its contents. Inside were what looked like old, tattered clothes, but beneath them, there were scraps of something darker. Pieces of fabric stained with what I could only guess was blood. There were also strange symbols scrawled on the walls in what appeared to be charcoal, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I felt a wave of panic surge through me. My breathing quickened, and I suddenly felt like I couldn't get out of that house fast enough. "I need to go," I said, standing up abruptly. The old man didn't move at first. His expression didn't change. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine. "It's too late for that," he said softly. "You're already here." Before I could react, I heard a sound from the other room, a faint, wet slapping noise, like something dragging across the floor. I froze, my heart racing. The old man didn't acknowledge the sound, but I could feel his gaze intensifying. I turned to leave, but my legs felt heavy, like they were moving through water. My vision blurred, and the air seemed to grow colder with every passing second. I turned back to the door, but it was no longer there. The room was shifting, the walls moving inward, closing in on me. The old man's voice whispered through the darkness, low and chilling. "You should have stayed in your car." That's when I realized what was happening. This wasn't just some house in the middle of nowhere. It was a trap. I didn't know how or why, but I knew I had to get out, and fast. I stumbled toward the window, trying to break through the glass, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the whole house was alive, breathing with a life of its own. I could feel the air growing heavier, suffocating me. I don't remember how I managed to escape. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe something else. All I know is that I was suddenly back outside, running as fast as my legs would carry me, the old man's voice echoing behind me. I don't know what happened to him or what that house truly was. I don't know if he was a ghost or if something worse was lurking in the shadows. But I know this, I never ran out of gas again. I learned that night the hard way that some places, some roads are better left unexplored.
Next story.
I had never been the superstitious type. Growing up, my parents had always told me to avoid certain things. Never walk under ladders, never open an umbrella inside, and of course, never run out of gas in the middle of nowhere. But to me, these were just old tales, things people said to keep you out of trouble. I had learned to be more practical. I kept my car full of gas, kept my phone charged, and made sure to stick to the main roads when I was out driving late at night. It was a Wednesday when everything changed. I had been driving back home after visiting some friends in a neighboring town. It was already past midnight, and the only company I had was the endless stretch of highway and the hum of my car's engine. The road was quiet, too quiet, in fact. I hadn't passed another car for miles. I had taken this route 100 times before, so I wasn't worried. I knew it like the back of my hand. Then the car hiccuped. It wasn't anything major at first, just a sputter, and then the engine hummed back to life. I glanced at the gas gauge. Full. It was odd, though. I'd been on this road long enough that I should have been running low by now. I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then the engine hiccuped again. This time it didn't come back to life. The car sputtered and then rolled to a stop. I slammed my palm against the steering wheel, cursing under my breath. I had never been the type to run out of gas. I always filled up before it got close. I checked the gauge again. It was still reading full. A sinking feeling began to settle in my gut. I tried starting the car again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Panic began to creep in. I grabbed my phone, but of course there was no signal. No surprise there. This stretch of highway was known for dead zones. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. It wasn't the end of the world. I had been in worse situations before. The next town was only about 15 miles away, and I could always call for help once I got there. I stepped out of the car and locked the door behind me. The cold night air hit me like a slap. The moonlight illuminated the long, empty road ahead of me. The trees on either side were dark, their branches swaying in the wind. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and began walking. The road felt longer than it ever had before. The silence was oppressive. There was something eerie about the emptiness, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But the further I walked, the more uneasy I became. About half an hour in, I saw something in the distance. It looked like a house, dimly lit from the inside. I had never noticed it before, and I was certain I hadn't passed it on my way into the area. It was an old house, definitely abandoned, with peeling paint and broken windows. There was a strange, unnatural glow coming from one of the windows. I approached cautiously, the hairs on my neck prickling. Something didn't feel right. But I was desperate. This could be my chance to find help. I knocked on the door. There was no answer. But I could hear something. A faint sound coming from inside, like muffled voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I knocked again, this time louder, but still nothing. The wind had started to pick up, and I was growing impatient. I was about to leave when the door creaked open by itself. I froze. There was no one standing behind it. Just an empty, dark hallway inside. I hesitated for a moment. Should I go in? Should I just walk away? But something compelled me to step inside. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that made me jump. I spun around, but there was no one. The hallway was completely dark except for that eerie glow coming from the room at the end of the corridor. I took a deep breath and made my way down the hall. The voices were louder now, though they still sounded distant, like they were coming from behind a thick wall. I reached the room with the glow, and when I opened the door, I immediately wished I hadn't. The room was full of mirrors. They were all over the walls, the ceiling, and even the floor. Some were cracked, others completely distorted, but the most unsettling part was what was reflected back at me. I saw myself. But I wasn't alone. In every mirror, there were dozens of other versions of me, all standing in the reflection, staring at me with blank expressions. Some of them were smiling, while others had twisted, unnatural faces. It was as though they were trapped behind the glass, watching, waiting. I stumbled backward, my heart racing in my chest. I had to get out of there. I turned to leave, but when I looked back down the hallway, I saw something else. A figure was standing in the shadows, watching me. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its features were hidden in the darkness. The air around me grew colder, and I felt as if something was pulling me back into the room. "Help me," the figure whispered, its voice barely audible. I blinked, and the figure was gone. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell was happening? I ran out of the room, through the hallway, and back to the front door, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't open. I panicked. I tried again, but the door wouldn't budge. The house seemed to be shifting, like it was alive, trapping me inside. "Help me." The voice came again, this time from behind me. I whipped around to see a face in the mirror on the wall. The same face I had seen in the reflections earlier, but now it was right there, inches away from me. Its eyes were hollow, its lips stretched into a grotesque smile. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. The walls seemed to close in around me as the whispers grew louder, until they were all I could hear. I felt myself growing faint, my vision blurring. Then, as quickly as it had all started, everything stopped. The house was silent. The mirrors were gone. The door to the outside opened easily, and the cold night air rushed in. I stepped out, gasping for breath, and found myself standing on the road again. I looked around, but the house was gone. There was nothing but the stretch of highway and my car still sitting there, just as it had been when I first stopped. I didn't think about it too much. I didn't want to. I got back in my car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. But every time I pass that stretch of road now, I swear I see something in the distance. A faint light, a flicker of movement, like the shadows are watching me, waiting for me to come back.
Next story.
I never thought something as simple as running out of gas could change your life. But that night, it did. It was a rainy Friday, the kind of downpour where it's hard to see a few feet in front of you. I'd been driving on a lonely stretch of highway for what felt like hours, heading to a friend's cabin for a weekend getaway. The road was long, narrow, and winding, cutting through dense woods on either side. The type of place you only venture into if you're looking for solitude. No towns nearby, no lights, just you, the road, and whatever's out there in the dark. I glanced at the gas gauge and my stomach sank. I'd been pushing it for miles, but I figured I could make it just a little further. I didn't want to stop in the middle of nowhere, especially with the rain coming down so hard, but the car was starting to sputter, and then dead silence. The engine turned off, and I coasted to a stop. My phone had no signal, and there was nothing around. Not a house in sight, no lights to guide me. It was pitch black out there, save for the occasional flash of lightning, casting everything in an eerie, ghostly light. I had no choice but to get out of the car and see if I could find help. I grabbed my flashlight, hoping the rain wouldn't kill the batteries, and stepped out into the wet night. The air was thick with mist, and the trees loomed tall and dark around me, as if watching me. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders and started walking. Every step felt like it took me deeper into some forgotten corner of the world. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, and I had no idea where I was going. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a light, a small, warm glow in the distance. It seemed to be coming from a cabin perched just off the road. I didn't think twice. I needed help, and that light was my only hope. I hurried toward the cabin, my steps quick but cautious. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The light was flickering, not like a normal bulb, but more like a candle, flickering and dancing in the wind, even though there was no breeze. I knocked on the door, my hand trembling. The air around the cabin was heavy, like something was off. The door creaked open after a long moment, revealing an old woman standing in the doorway. She was frail, with thin, graying hair that hung loose around her shoulders. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those eyes were wide and too bright in the dim light, giving her a look that made me feel uneasy. "Can I help you?" she asked in a voice that sounded ancient, cracked with age, but still strong. I explained my situation, how my car had broken down, and how I had walked for what felt like forever. I asked if I could use her phone to call for help. The woman didn't immediately respond. She just stared at me for a moment, as if considering something. Then, slowly, she stepped aside, allowing me to enter. As I walked into the cabin, I immediately felt the temperature drop. It wasn't the cold of the rain, it was something colder, like the air itself had been frozen for decades. The interior was dim, lit only by that flickering candle. The room was cluttered with old furniture covered in dusty sheets, shelves of strange trinkets, and books stacked high, some of them open as if they had been read recently. "Sit," she said softly, pointing to a chair by the fire. "I'll make you some tea." I didn't want to sit. I didn't want to stay here, but I was exhausted, and the rain was getting worse. So I sat down, trying not to look at the strange collection of objects scattered around the room. There was an old portrait on the wall, and something about it made my skin crawl. The faces in the painting seemed to be watching me, their eyes following me as I moved. The woman disappeared into another room, and I found myself staring at the fire. The warmth was comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the cabin. It was the whole place. I felt like I had walked into a trap, a place where I was no longer welcome, a place I shouldn't have come to. When the woman returned, she was holding a steaming mug of tea. She handed it to me, and I took it with shaky hands. I didn't want to drink it, but I felt like I had no choice. She was watching me intently, her gaze never leaving my face. It was like she was waiting for me to do something. I took a sip. Instantly, I felt something strange. My head grew heavy, my vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin around me. I put the mug down, but it was too late. The room tilted to one side, and I collapsed backward, the world around me turning black. When I woke up, I was in a different room. The fire was gone, and I was lying on a cold, hard surface. I tried to sit up, but my body felt weak. My mind was foggy, like I was waking from a dream, but everything around me felt too real, too unsettling. The room was small, stone walls lined with old shelves, filled with jars that seemed to hold strange things, roots, bones, and what looked like blackened feathers. In the corner of the room, there was a large wooden chest, slightly open, and I could just make out something inside. I didn't want to look too closely. My heart was pounding, and my breathing was ragged. I tried to stand up, but as I did, I felt a hand on my shoulder. The old woman was standing behind me, her eyes too bright, too knowing. She was smiling, but there was no warmth in her smile. It was more like a mask. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice now soft and conspiratorial. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My head felt heavy again, and I was terrified that the same thing would happen, that I'd fall back into the darkness, never waking up. She moved closer, her breath cold on my ear. "You see, child, this place isn't just a cabin, it's a sanctuary." "A sanctuary?" I managed to croak, but I didn't understand. "Yes," she said, her grin widening. "A sanctuary for those who run out of gas, for those who stray from the road. You were chosen, you see. You walked right into it." Before I could say anything, she turned away, and I saw it. The chest. It was open fully now, and inside was something that made my blood run cold. It was a collection of things, scraps of clothes, broken watches, and the remains of what had once been a person. And there, in the center, was a necklace, shimmering in the dim light. A necklace I had seen before. I had seen it on the road lying by my car when I broke down. Someone had been here before me. And they weren't coming back. The old woman's voice broke through my panic. "Don't worry, you'll be with them soon." And as the darkness crept back in, I knew with a sickening certainty, I wasn't getting out.
Next story.
It was a Tuesday night when everything went wrong. I remember it vividly. I had just finished a long day at work, and I was making my way back home after dark, down one of those old country roads that no one uses unless they absolutely have to. My gas gauge was already on the lower side, but there was a small town about 10 miles ahead, and I figured I could make it there without much trouble. The road stretched endlessly before me, illuminated by the faint glow of my headlights. The trees along the sides seemed to close in as the night deepened, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers. It wasn't exactly the most welcoming place, but it wasn't like I had any other choice. As I neared the small town, my car sputtered. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just my engine idling, but then it happened again, and this time the engine died completely. I sat there for a moment, cursing under my breath, before I tried to restart it. Nothing. Just the clicking sound of a dead engine. My heart sank. The nearest gas station was back a few miles, but I wasn't sure I could walk all that way, and there was no way to get any signal on my phone out here. I thought I saw a light up ahead, so I decided to walk toward it, hoping it was a house or some kind of help. The night air was crisp, a little too cold for my comfort. I hugged my jacket closer to my body as I made my way down the narrow road. As I walked, I noticed something odd. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just this oppressive silence. It felt as though the entire world had gone still. Eventually, I reached the source of the light. It was an old gas station, the kind you'd see in old Western films. The neon lights above the pumps flickered sporadically, and the sign said, "Out of service," in a faded, peeling red. My heart sank. There were no cars, no sign of life, nothing that looked like it belonged in the present day. I glanced around, my breath clouding in the cold night air. The place was run down, the pumps cracked, and the building itself looked like it had been abandoned for years. The only thing that seemed out of place was the faint light shining from the window of the small shack attached to the gas station. The faintest glow, like a lamp. I thought maybe there was someone inside, maybe a caretaker or someone who could help me out. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing against the empty walls. No answer. I knocked again, a little harder this time. Still, nothing. I felt an unsettling chill run down my spine. Maybe I was just overthinking things. But then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, wearing a thick overcoat, and his face was obscured by the shadows. There was something about him that seemed off, his eyes, wide and hollow, peering out from the darkness. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at me. I'm stranded," I said, trying to sound casual despite the unease creeping up on me. "My car broke down a few miles back. Do you have a phone I could use or any help around here?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. Something about the gesture felt wrong, like he was hiding something. But I was desperate. I needed help, and this was the only place around. I stepped inside, and the moment I did, I felt it. A coldness that wasn't just from the night air. It was as though the temperature inside the building had dropped several degrees. The place was poorly lit, with dim lights hanging overhead, and the shelves were stacked with dusty cans and old tools. It looked abandoned. Yet, not. There was a lingering sense of something ancient, something that didn't belong. "Where's your phone?" I asked, my voice trembling a little. The man didn't answer. He simply gestured to a small counter at the back of the room where a payphone stood, covered in dust. I walked over to it and picked up the receiver, but before I could dial, the phone gave off a strange, high-pitched ringing, like it was out of service. I tried again, but the same noise filled my ears. I looked back at the man, but he had vanished. Panic surged through me. I turned in a circle, searching the room. The silence was deafening. It was then I noticed something odd in the corner, an old wooden box about the size of a coffin. It was covered in layers of dust. The faintest glint of light from the overhead bulb reflected off something inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved toward it, cautiously. As I opened the box, the air around me grew even colder. Inside, there was a tangle of old, yellowed maps, weathered photographs, and a set of keys. But the most bizarre thing was what I found beneath them. An old, worn journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting inside was messy, frantic, almost as though whoever wrote it was losing their mind. I pulled the journal out, flipping through the pages. It was a collection of ramblings, disconnected thoughts, and strange notes about the gas station, about people who had come and never left. The entries were dated back decades. One entry caught my eye. "The station doesn't run on gas. It runs on souls. The light above the pump isn't just a sign, it's a lure. It calls them in. Once you enter, you're trapped. There's no way out. The man is the keeper, the one who waits. He brings them in. He takes them. They don't leave." The words on the page seemed to warp before my eyes. I dropped the journal, my heart racing. The room was growing colder by the second. I turned to run, but as I reached the door, I heard it. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Then the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The lights flickered, and the man's figure reappeared at the door. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his lips curling into a grin that didn't look human. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Now you're part of the station." Suddenly, the walls seemed to close in, the floor beneath me shifting. The ground groaned and the air thickened, suffocating me. The man's laughter echoed around me as the room twisted and the walls seemed to melt away. I woke up on the side of the road, my car in front of me, the gas station nowhere in sight. My phone was dead. The entire night felt like a dream, but the feeling that something was off never left. I checked my gas gauge. It was full. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I swear I saw him standing at the edge of the road, watching.
Next story.
I've been driving for what feels like hours. My hands are stiff from gripping the steering wheel too tightly, and I can feel the tension in my shoulders. The sun had set hours ago, and now I was in the middle of nowhere. Just a dark stretch of road with trees on either side, so thick that I couldn't see beyond them. It was the kind of place where if your car broke down, you'd be stuck for a long time before someone would find you. That's exactly what happened. I was driving down a lonely road, heading home after a visit to my sister's house. The gas gauge had been on empty for a while, but I'd figured I could make it to the next gas station. I was wrong. I've always been the type to push my luck, thinking I could just get a little bit farther. But that night, luck wasn't on my side. I heard the engine sputter a few times, and then with a final cough, the car rolled to a stop. I looked at the dashboard in disbelief. Empty. I cursed under my breath and checked my phone. Of course, no signal. The road I was on didn't even have a name. It was a small back road that only locals seemed to know. I looked around, hoping to see some lights in the distance, some sign of civilization, but there was nothing. Just the dark, silent trees and the sound of my own breathing. I sat there for a minute, trying to figure out my next move. There was nothing to do but walk to the nearest town. I didn't want to leave my car behind, but I didn't have much of a choice. If I stayed here too long, someone could come along and take advantage of my situation. So I grabbed my jacket and started walking. I had no idea how far it was to the nearest town. My guess was it would take me a couple of hours, maybe more. The wind had picked up and the cold bit at my skin. I tried not to think about how isolated I was. In the back of my mind, I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right, but I pushed it aside. After all, it was just a quiet country road. What could possibly go wrong? I hadn't walked for more than 20 minutes when I saw something ahead of me. At first, I thought it was just the shadow of a tree or some kind of animal. But as I got closer, I realized it was a figure, a person, standing on the side of the road. They were just standing there, completely still, watching me as I approached. I froze in my tracks. I couldn't see their face, but the outline of their body was tall and thin, their posture unnaturally rigid. Excuse me, I called out, trying to sound calm. I'm out of gas, and I'm walking to the nearest town. Can you help me? The figure didn't respond. I took a few cautious steps forward, feeling my heartbeat quicken. The air around me felt colder, and the silence was almost suffocating. I stopped just a few feet away, and that's when the figure moved. It didn't walk. It glided. The movement was too smooth, like it was floating just above the ground. My stomach dropped, and I took a step back, my throat dry. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure's head tilted slightly, almost as though it was studying me. Then it spoke. The voice was low and hollow, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the earth. "You shouldn't be out here." I didn't know how to respond. I was terrified, but I didn't want to show it. I forced myself to take another step forward, my feet feeling like lead. "Look, I'm just trying to get help." "I'm not from around here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure slowly lifted its arm, pointing down the road. I looked in the direction it was pointing, but there was nothing there. Just more trees, more darkness. "Go back," the voice rasped. "It's not safe." A chill ran down my spine, and every part of me screamed to turn around and run. But I couldn't. Something in the way the figure moved, the way it glided without making a sound, had me rooted to the spot. "Please, just let me go," I begged, my voice trembling. "I just need help." The figure's head tilted even farther, and for a brief moment I saw its face, a face so pale it looked like it had never seen the light of day. Its eyes were black, deep, endless, and its mouth was twisted into something that might have been a smile, but it didn't seem right. "You'll never leave," the figure whispered. That was the last thing I heard before I bolted. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back. The sounds of my footsteps on the dirt road were drowned out by the rushing blood in my ears, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I ran for what felt like hours, but I couldn't stop. I didn't care how far I was from my car, from the road, from the town. All I cared about was getting away from that thing. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I came to a clearing. I looked up and saw a light in the distance. I knew that if I could make it there, I'd be safe. So I pushed myself harder, sprinting toward the light. As I got closer, I realized it was a street lamp, part of a small town. By the time I reached the first house, I was gasping for air, barely able to stay on my feet. I knocked on the door frantically, and an older man answered, looking at me in confusion. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I could barely get the words out. "Please, I need help." I was walking and there was something on the road. The man's face went pale and he stepped back. "You're not supposed to be out there." I blinked at him, confused. "What?" He shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not safe to walk those roads at night. You don't know what's out there. People don't come back." I felt a cold shiver run through me. It hit me then that the figure I'd seen, the one that told me I wouldn't leave, wasn't just some strange person. It was something else, something that haunted that road, something that didn't let people leave. I stayed with the man that night, too afraid to go anywhere else. The next morning, I went back to where my car had broken down, but when I got there, there was no sign of the road, no sign of my car, nothing but trees. It was as if that stretch of road had never existed. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night, but I've never driven on that road again, and I'll never forget the voice that whispered, "You'll never leave."
Next story.
I never believed in ghost stories, at least not until I experienced it myself. It all started on a typical Friday evening. I had just finished a long week at work and decided to take a weekend trip upstate to clear my head. It was supposed to be a short getaway, just me and my car on a quiet stretch of highway. There's something peaceful about the open road, especially when you've got nothing but time and your own thoughts. I left my apartment just as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. I wanted to avoid traffic, so I took the back roads, something I hadn't done before, but the GPS said it was a quicker route. At first, everything was calm. The wind picked up a little, rustling the leaves and swaying the trees, but nothing felt off. The road was narrow and winding, lined with dense forests on either side. It felt like the kind of place where people get lost. About 3 hours into the drive, my fuel gauge dropped dangerously close to empty. I figured I had a few more miles before I'd need to stop, but I hadn't seen a gas station in what felt like forever. The sun had already set, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the road. I kept driving, hoping for a sign of civilization, but there was nothing but darkness. The occasional roadside sign appeared, but they were all faded and barely legible. That's when I saw it. Up ahead, a dimly lit sign blinked weakly in the distance. Gas 5 miles ahead. Relief washed over me. At least there would be a place to stop soon. I pushed the accelerator, willing my car to go faster, but the miles seemed to stretch on longer than they should have. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the gas station appear in the distance. I pulled in, eager to fill up and get back on the road. The station was old, run down even, but it had that nostalgic charm that some places hold on to. A flickering neon sign above the pumps read "Open," though the letters were barely visible in the dim light. The air was heavy, like something was watching me. As I stepped out of the car, the rustling of leaves was the only sound that accompanied me. The gas station itself looked abandoned, but the pumps were still standing, though aged. There was something unsettling about it. I walked over to the nearest pump, my eyes scanning the dark surroundings. The gas station felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I walked to the door, thinking I'd ask if anyone was around to take payment. The door creaked open, and the smell of old wood and musty air hit me. The inside was even darker, save for the faint light coming from a single bulb hanging above the counter. No one was behind the counter, but the register was open, like someone had just left. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. There was no response, so I decided to just fill up and leave. My car's gas tank was nearly empty, and I wasn't sure how much longer it would last. As I was pumping the gas, I heard a soft sound, a faint tapping. I looked around, trying to place where it was coming from, but everything was still. The tapping continued, almost rhythmic, like someone was knocking on wood. It didn't make sense. I turned back to the pump, shaking my head. "Just get the gas and go," I muttered to myself. But the tapping was growing louder and closer. I hesitated. My eyes darted to the far corner of the station, where the darkness seemed to swirl and pulse. It wasn't just my imagination anymore. There was something out there, something that didn't belong. The tapping became frantic, louder, as though it was right behind me. My heart raced. I spun around, looking for anything, any sign of a person, a car, a shadow, anything that could explain the sound. But there was nothing. I backed away from the pump, my mind screaming for me to leave. That's when I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the station, a tall, thin man in an old, tattered coat, his face hidden in the shadows. I froze. He hadn't been there a moment ago, and I had no idea where he had come from. The tapping stopped. The air grew colder. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The man slowly lifted his hand, his long, bony fingers beckoning me forward. His eyes, if you could call them eyes, were dark pits, hollow and empty. There was nothing in them, just a void. "Please." The voice was low, rasping, like something was dragging it out of him, unwillingly. "Help me." A chill ran down my spine. The words weren't human, they weren't real. I stumbled backward, tripping over the gravel beneath my feet. My legs wouldn't work properly as fear overtook me. I turned to run, but before I could even move, the sound of footsteps behind me stopped me dead in my tracks. The man was closer now, impossibly close, standing right in front of the door to the station. I could hear his breathing now, ragged and wet, like something was trying to force itself out. I reached for the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled to open it. But before I could make it inside, I felt something cold grip my arm, pulling me back. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there. Nothing except the dark road behind me, stretching endlessly into the night. But someone was watching me. I felt it. It was as if the air itself was alive, alive with anger, with hunger. I glanced back at the gas station, trying to catch my breath. The man was gone. The tapping had stopped. The wind howled through the trees, but there was no sound of footsteps, no movement at all. For a moment, I thought it was over, that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. I quickly hopped back into my car and slammed the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and pulled away. I didn't care about the gas anymore. I didn't care about anything except getting away from that place. As I drove, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind me. Just the dark stretch of road and the faint light of the gas station fading into the distance. I never told anyone about what happened. I couldn't. No one would believe me. But the truth is, I don't think it was just a gas station. And I don't think I was the only one who passed through there that night. Something else was out there. Something old and hungry, and it was waiting for me.
Next story.
It was supposed to be just another late-night drive. I had spent the evening visiting my parents and decided to head home, taking the usual route through the back roads of the country. It was a quiet drive, the kind of peaceful trip that's almost meditative, with nothing but the soft hum of the engine and the occasional flicker of the headlights cutting through the darkness. But that night was different. As I neared the halfway point of the drive, I noticed something strange. My gas gauge was teetering dangerously close to empty. I had been driving for a while, but there was no gas station in sight. The rural highway I was on had no streetlights, and the few houses I passed were dark, likely with their occupants long asleep. I cursed myself for not stopping earlier to fill up, but I was already too far from the nearest town. I pushed on, figuring I could make it to the next town before the car stalled. But that's when it happened. The engine sputtered, and then, without warning, the car came to a complete stop. I wasn't surprised. The gauge had been flashing empty for miles, but I still felt a wave of frustration wash over me. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard, trying to figure out my options. The last thing I wanted was to be stranded on this desolate road, especially this late at night. But with no phone signal, no flashlight, and no idea where the next gas station was, I had little choice but to start walking. I got out of the car and started down the road, hoping that some kind of miracle would happen. The wind had picked up, and the trees along the roadside seemed to whisper as they swayed in the breeze. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and kept walking, the darkness pressing in from all sides. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something in the distance. A light. A small, glowing orb on the horizon. I squinted, trying to make it out through the dark. It was too far away to be a car, but it was too bright to be anything else. The light flickered a few times and then it seemed to move, just a little, but enough for me to realize it was coming closer. I stood frozen, trying to figure out what I was seeing. The closer it got, the more I could make out its shape. It wasn't a car, it wasn't a person. It was something else. The light hovered in the air, shifting and undulating like it was alive. At first, it seemed like a ball of fire, but as it drew closer, I saw that it wasn't a flame at all. It was a faint, pulsating glow, as though it was made of some ethereal substance. The air around it seemed to shimmer with an odd, cold energy, making my skin crawl. I stepped back instinctively, but the light kept coming toward me, its movement eerily fluid. My heart began to race, and a voice deep inside me urged me to turn and run. But I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy, my mind frozen in disbelief. The light stopped just a few feet away from me. It hovered there, and for a long moment, nothing happened. The air grew colder, the hairs on my arms standing on end. It was as though the world itself had stopped. Then I heard a whisper. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like a series of soft sounds that my mind interpreted as words. It was quiet at first, barely audible, but then it grew louder until I could hear it clearly. Help me. I froze, the words reverberating in my chest. Who's there? I managed to croak, my voice trembling. There was no answer. The light flickered again, then seemed to expand, growing larger and brighter. My eyes stung from the intensity of it, and I found myself blinking rapidly, trying to adjust. But the more I blinked, the more the light seemed to distort until it wasn't a light anymore. It was a figure of a woman, her body shimmering with the same pale, unnatural glow. Her face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the outline of her features, a mouth that opened in a silent scream, hands stretched out toward me as though begging for something. Her form was barely solid, as if the light itself was part of her, weaving in and out of her body. I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond. The figure reached out toward me, and that's when I realized something truly horrifying. She wasn't alone. The more I looked, the more figures appeared around her, each one emerging from the darkness like forgotten ghosts. They were transparent, flickering in and out of existence, but they all shared the same desperate, pleading expression. Their mouths opened in soundless screams, their hands reaching toward me, toward the warmth and life that I represented. Help us, the woman's voice whispered again, this time much closer, as if she were standing right next to me. Suddenly, I could hear the sound of voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once, murmuring words that I couldn't understand. They all seemed to be coming from the figures, their mouths forming shapes but not producing any sound. I could feel their presence around me, the coldness of the air seeping into my bones. Without thinking, I stumbled backward, my feet scrambling to move. I turned and ran. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I dared not look back, but I could feel the weight of their gaze following me. I heard the whispers growing louder, the cries for help echoing in the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the town. It was only then, when I saw the streetlights and the familiar shapes of buildings, that I dared to slow down. But even then, I could feel their presence lingering in the air, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. I've never told anyone about that night. I don't think anyone would believe me. But every time I drive down that stretch of road now, I can't help but feel a sense of dread creeping over me. I've learned to fill up my gas tank at every opportunity, and I never drive at night without checking the gauge first. And sometimes, when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I swear I can still hear those whispers calling from the darkness.